9 years ago, we did something pretty crazy. We sold nearly all of our possessions and moved to a city in Florida that we had never even been to before.
And in this video, we're going to tell you all about that experience, what we love and don't love about living in Florida, what surprised us about living in Florida, and if we have any regrets about taking the leap.
Now let's get into it.
First things first, let's talk about why we moved to Florida. Now, the short answer to that question, which we gave you in our Q&A video a few weeks ago, is that we just got sick of the cold weather.
And that is true, but there's a little more to the story than that. At that time, we were living in Kansas City, we had recently gotten married, we had purchased and remodeled a home, we were living in a nice suburban neighborhood, had good jobs. I'd say overall our lives were pretty comfortable.
But we soon learned that we wanted more out of life than just being comfortable and started aspiring for a more active and adventurous lifestyle. And that made us really grow to start despising the Kansas winters, where it was cold and we'd be cooped up inside for the vast majority of each day.
And we were also growing more and more dissatisfied with our jobs because at that time we had limited vacation days and no ability to work remotely. So when one day, out of the blue, Skylar brought the idea to me to move to Florida, I was on board.
In a matter of weeks, we had our house on the market, and in just a few days after that, we accepted an offer. But the sale happened so fast and we weren't quite ready to make that big leap. So we did a short-term rental on a small apartment in Kansas City where we'd have time to start planning for the big move and to save up some money.
Yeah, that apartment was tiny and cheap, but it did allow us to save up the money that we'd need for a couple of months without any jobs because we had no idea how long it was going to take us to find employment once we moved to Florida. And that actually gets us to our next topic, which is how we prepared for the big move.
And that transition period was huge, not only to save up a little money, but also to get used to living in a much smaller place.
And not just that, but also living with far fewer possessions.
That's true. When we moved out of our 2,000 square foot house and into a 600 square foot apartment, we obviously needed to get rid of a lot of stuff. And we continue to get rid of more stuff while we live in that apartment because ultimately we'd have to fit all of our possessions into 2 cars and 1 U-Box.
We also used those 6 months to research cities along the Gulf Coast of Florida to decide where we were going to move. But I really should say that Skylar used that time to research because he is definitely the planner in our relationship.
Yeah, and that process basically involved identifying a list of wants for our new home, which for us included being close to great beaches, being close to airports, and also being in a good job market.
But when we put in our letters of resignation to our employers in Kansas City, something unexpected happened. Skylar's employer offered to allow him to work remotely from Florida.
Yeah, and since we no longer had to worry about neither of us having an income when we got to Florida, moving to a city with a good job market suddenly wasn't as big of a priority. And as a result, we ended up in Sarasota.
And what's crazy is that we had never even been to Sarasota before we moved there. And what's even crazier is that we spent the first 2 weeks living in Sarasota in a Holiday Inn that we booked through Priceline the day we arrived in town.
Yeah, and we'll get more into that in a little bit, but first we wanted to talk about the logistics of moving across the country without having a place to move into when we arrived and without breaking the bank.
So for us, our goal was to get to Florida as inexpensively as possible. So hiring movers or renting a truck and driving it across the country were not options. We ultimately decided to sell as much of our stuff as possible and move the rest of it in our cars.
Yeah, and what we couldn't fit into our cars, we ended up putting in a U-Box, which is essentially a shipping container that we rented at a Kansas City U-Haul facility and then had sent down to a U-Haul facility in Sarasota.
Now, one of the downfalls of going the U-Box route is that we didn't know exactly when our U-Box would arrive in Sarasota. But that was okay because we still had not yet secured a place to live.
Yeah, and even though the U-Box did end up arriving before we could even move into our new place, it was fine because it was able to just sit at the U-Haul facility in Sarasota until we were able to move in.
It did take us a couple of weeks before we could move into our new apartment, but I didn't mind because that hotel was actually really nice.
Yeah, we checked into that hotel and I started working out of my remote Sarasota office the very next morning, while Jamie got to spend her first few days in Florida chilling in the hotel pool and sauna all day.
Hey, but I also was job searching and apartment hunting.
And getting a free year's worth of Big Macs.
That is also true. So during this time, there was a brand new McDonald's, and the management thought it would be a great promotion to give the first 100 customers free Big Macs for a year. So because I wasn't working, I couldn't pass up on the opportunity, especially because we were living on only one income at the time.
Yeah, but thankfully that wasn't for long.
Yeah, luckily my job search did go really well, and I was able to accept an offer within the first 3 weeks of our move.
Now, within the first 6 months or so of living in that tiny apartment, we knew that we wanted to stay in Florida long term, but we also knew that we were really gonna miss our friends and family, and we wanted to be able to host them when they came to visit. So we started looking for a house with a couple extra bedrooms.
Now we ended up buying the ugliest house in the nicest neighborhood that we could afford and started fixing it up. And after a couple of years, we had transformed it into one of the nicer ones in the neighborhood. And by that time, Florida was feeling like home and life was pretty good.
But around a couple of years later, we started visiting downtown St. Pete. And soon after that, we were visiting almost every weekend. And even though we loved living in Sarasota, we found ourselves really craving the faster paced, more energetic atmosphere that St. Pete offered. So we decided to sell our house in Sarasota and move into an apartment in downtown St. Pete.
And once again, we found that we had acquired way too much stuff and would have to sell nearly all of it to move into our small apartment downtown. But thanks to Facebook Marketplace, it only took a couple of weeks to sell most everything, and just us, our clothes, and a few possessions made the move to downtown St. Pete.
Yeah, and after 3 years of living in St. Pete and 9 years of living in Florida, we've learned a lot about ourselves and a lot about living in the Sunshine State. So in the second half of this video, we're gonna share some of our biggest likes and dislikes, surprises, and regrets of moving to Florida.
So I'm gonna start with a few of the things that I love about living in Florida. And the first two are pretty obvious, and that's the weather and the beaches. Now, me personally, I don't mind the heat, I don't mind the humidity. I love living in a place where there is sunshine so many days out of the year. It's so easy to be able to be outside throughout the year. And really, I think that's a huge perk of living in Florida. Now, let's talk a little bit about those beaches, because we have access to some of the most beautiful beaches in the world. The sand here is soft, it's sugary, the color of the water is this gorgeous turquoise color, and I can't take that for granted.
Yeah, and tying into the weather, one thing I love about being in Florida is we never have to worry about shoveling snow or driving on icy roads. Another thing I loved about moving here is that we pretty much immediately got like a 7% raise in our incomes because there's no state taxes here. Now, depending on where you move from, you might see an increase in sales tax or property taxes when you move down here. But for us, we definitely saw an improvement in our financial situation. And one more thing that I love is just the fact that you can find great seafood, Caribbean food, Cuban food, and many other types of food down here in Florida that you just could not find up in the Midwest.
And I also want to add that we do have access to fresh produce like citrus, vegetables, and other fruits year round, which for me is another benefit, because living in the Midwest, that stuff is very seasonal. And down here, we're able to find it pretty affordably. So I would say that since we moved down to Florida, our diets have actually improved because of the increased access to those fresh fruits and vegetables.
Now, we don't love everything about living in Florida, and for my first dislike, I gotta go back to the food. Now, we came from Kansas City, which had some of the best barbecue in the entire country, and also a lot of really great Chinese food, and we've had a really hard time finding that down here in Florida. So not all of the food down here in Florida is better than in the Midwest. Another thing I don't love about Florida is just how flat it is. I don't think we really realized until we moved down here, but the southern half of Florida is one of the flattest places in the entire country. And where we came from in the Midwest definitely didn't have any mountains, but it did have a lot of nice rolling hills. And we've just really grown to miss the change in elevation. Now, one more thing that I don't love about living here in Florida is the housing affordability. And that's more of a recent thing, because when we first moved down to Florida about 9 years ago, it was slightly more expensive to find a nice house in like the Tampa, St. Pete area compared to Kansas City, but not that much more expensive. But especially over the last couple of years, the housing prices in Tampa, St. Pete have shot up dramatically. And you're now gonna have to pay significantly more to find a nice house here around St. Pete than you would to find a comparable house in most areas of Kansas City.
Now my dislikes pretty much center around the traffic here. Now it didn't take us long to realize that people drive fast. So if we were on the interstate driving 5, maybe 10 miles over the speed limit, people were just like zooming by us all the time.
Yeah, and even though people seem to be speeding a lot more, you see way less people actually pulled over for speeding.
That is very true. Now the next thing I want to mention is just about the amount of traffic on the interstates, especially on I-4 between Tampa and Orlando. I don't think we've ever made that drive without encountering some sort of traffic nightmare that is
terrible.
Yeah, that has added a significant amount of time onto our trip. And the last thing I want to mention is the toll roads here. So where we lived in the Midwest, there were some tolls around, but nothing compared to the tolls in Florida, like in the Tampa-St. Pete area or in the Orlando area. So if you're considering moving here, a tip I would share is get your SunPass right away. Don't wait in line to pay manually every time, because that also will add a significant amount of time to your trips.
Now that we've touched on some of the things we love and don't love about living here in Florida, I think it's time to talk about some of the things that surprised us. And I think number one for me was just the diversity and the different cultures here in Florida. Because where we're from up in Iowa and Kansas, it doesn't really matter where you go within the states. The cultures are pretty much the same. But here in Florida, like if you go over to Miami, you're gonna find a much different culture than here in Tampa or St. Pete. And it's gonna be different yet if you go to other major cities like Orlando or Jacksonville.
Or even if you go inland to the small cities there, or even up in the Panhandle.
Yeah, that's true, but the diversity and different cultures is actually something we love about living here in Florida.
Yeah, Florida is known for being like a melting pot because people move here from all over the world, and we've really enjoyed getting to experience those different cultures.
Yeah, and that actually kind of ties in with another thing that surprised me, and that is the diversity of people. Like, we've met so many people, not only from other states, but from other countries as well. And surprisingly, we haven't met many people from Florida. Like, at least here in Tampa, St. Pete, you meet many more people like from the Midwest and New York and even Canada, it seems, than you do people that were actually born and raised here in Florida. Now, I'm sure that's different in the smaller towns inland, but definitely here in the more touristy spots, it's hard to find a native Floridian. And I think one more thing that surprised me about moving to Florida was the seasons. Now, if you talk to many Midwesterners, they'll tell you that they wouldn't want to move to Florida because they'd miss having seasons, but there are still seasons down here in Florida, and I think for me, there's probably 3. There's the season in the winter months where it's pretty dry, it cools down quite a bit at night, and it's just beautiful during the day. And then there's the summer season, which is ridiculously hot and muggy. It's like over 90 degrees pretty much every day. And it also storms at some point almost every day. And then I think the 3rd season would be those in-between months where it could be hot and muggy and storming, but it also could be absolutely beautiful. And I think what surprised me most about the weather down here was the dry season. Now, I think most Northerners see Florida as just being hot and rainy and muggy all the time, but there is dry season down here where it's not that uncommon for it to not rain for a few weeks at a time.
Now, the first thing that surprised me about moving to Florida was actually the thunderstorms. Now, in the Midwest, we're used to thunderstorms, but it wasn't until moving to Florida that we experienced like the Florida downpours. And we moved here during August, which was the rainy season, and oh my gosh, I was not prepared for how intense those storms would be. I just remember like white knuckling it the whole way driving through those storms.
Yeah, I'd never experienced so many people pulled over on the side of the roads during a thunderstorm. And you should probably also mention the sun rain.
Oh my gosh, the sun rain. So Florida was the first place we experienced what we call sun rain, when it's still like downpouring, but yet the sun is out. So not only can you not see because the rain is coming down so hard, but now you also have the sun like shining in your eyes and reflecting off of all the water.
It's like the worst driving conditions ever.
Now, the next thing that surprised me about living in Florida was the lack of alligator sightings. When we moved down here, I kind of expected that we would see them frequently.
All the time, and I was actually looking forward forward to it.
Yes, but that has not been our experience. So for us, the only time we've really seen alligators was when we were going to areas where alligators were protected, or just nature areas where we knew that they likely lived.
Yeah, we've been in Florida for like 9 years now, and we've never seen an alligator just like walking down the sidewalk or walking across the road.
No. It is funny though, because when we go back to the Midwest, we always have somebody ask us about alligator sightings, and I totally understand why, because like from watching the news, you would think that they are just out and about all the time in these residential areas. Now, a more recent thing that has surprised me about living in Florida is the variety of nature activities. Now, the first few years that we lived here, we pretty much lived at the beach. But that's because we were coming from the Midwest, you know, the very center of the United States, where we didn't have easy access to a nice body of water or a nice beach. But over the last few years, we have spent time in the natural springs, also in the state parks, and other areas where the animals are protected, and have just really been enjoying everything that the state of Florida has to offer.
Now, with all the things that surprised us about living here in Florida, there's definitely some Florida stereotypes that did turn out to be true. And number one for me was the heat. Like I said earlier, there's definitely a hot rainy season here in Florida. And while it rarely gets much above like 94 degrees here in Tampa, St. Pete, it does stay hot for a long period of time. So when late August comes around and it's been over 90 degrees every day for like 4 months straight, it does start to get a little bit old.
It does. And another thing that didn't surprise us was just the variety of bugs that we would have to deal with year round, whether it's mosquitoes, no-see-ums, or sand fleas.
Or cockroaches like the size of your face.
They're not that big, but we do
big.
have giant cockroaches down here. But you know, it's just a part of Florida that you kind of have to accept. And after being here a little while, you know, you get used to them.
Now, one more thing that has not surprised us about moving to Florida is the beaches. Now, the beaches are probably the main reason we moved down here 9 years ago, and they have not disappointed. And anyone who follows our channel knows that we have countless beautiful beaches here right in our backyard, and we've just begun exploring them.
Now, another thing that didn't surprise us about living in Florida was the influx of snowbirds and also tourists. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the snowbird term, that is for people who come down to Florida during the winter months to escape the cold and snowy weather up north. When we lived in Sarasota, we really experienced a snowbird season.
Yeah, especially on the roads.
Yes, the roads were a lot busier, the restaurants were a lot more crowded. Now, we don't experience that season quite as much here in St. Pete, but I would say all along this area of the Gulf Coast, we do experience tourists visiting here throughout the year. And we really see an increase in tourists during major holidays, also over spring break, and in the summer months.
Yeah, especially out on the beaches.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up this video by discussing any regrets we have about moving to Florida, we wanted to thank you for watching this video this far. And if there's any Florida-related topics that you'd like to see us discuss in a future episode, let us know in the comments.
Now let's get to those regrets. This is something we spent a significant amount of time talking about. And I think that we both agreed that we don't have any regrets about moving to Florida.
Yeah, we really came up with nothing. And that doesn't mean there's not things about the Midwest that we miss. First and foremost, we definitely miss our friends and family. Like I touched on earlier, we miss the hills. I really miss the wide open spaces of the Midwest, but we can't say we actually have any regrets about making the move down here.
No, we did also talk about the things that we would do differently. And really, we only came up with one thing, and that was just to do a better job of documenting the cross-country move and also the first few years in Sarasota.
Yeah, we have extremely limited footage from that time, and we had no intentions of ever becoming YouTubers back then, so it's not surprising that we didn't capture it very well, but we really wish we would have, because it was such a fun and exciting time for us, and not only would we love to look back on it ourselves, but we'd also love to be able to share that time with all of you.
Yeah, again, we want to thank you all for listening to our experience moving to Florida. And if you have any other questions about our experiences living in Florida, make sure to put those in the comments below.
And if you are thinking about visiting the Tampa St. Pete area or even moving here yourselves, go ahead and check out this playlist next.
Thanks for watching.